This is hopefully the last video we're gonna do on a BattleStar because I'm like 90% sure that there are no more to talk about. I thought the Valkyrie, the youngest sibling of the Gunbrick family, was the last one, but no, as is tradition, I entirely forgot about the middle child. So today, we're finally making a video to round out all the official BattleStar designs, not including like the pocket Battlestar stealth thing. Those don't count. The Minerva, a disgusting, extreme, awful design that should have never been made, and a design that entirely disrespects what it means to be a Battlestar, because it entirely abandoned half of what makes them such fun ships to nerd out over. Mainly, it's a weak POS that can't take a punch. Before we get into things, though, and I get to rant for the next 20 minutes about why I despise this thing, generic greetings and welcome to Science Insanity, a channel dedicated to bringing my absolute hatred of this abomination and everything turbo nerdy to you. And while normally I'd introduce my co-host here, unfortunately there was some issues with scheduling and I lost the original recording that we did, so it's just me today. Oops. And while normally I'd be over the moon to talk about ships from Battlestar Galactica, this entire episode is going to be a hit piece. First, because this is a deadlock-only ship that doesn't have much extended universe lore. Second, I hate it with a passion because it is everything a proper Battlestar is not supposed to be. Guns aplenty, sure, but if you can barely make it halfway to the goal, you aren't exactly a winner, are you? The lore it does have is also just wrong. There are wonderful statements where somebody will make a claim, and when you go to fact check it, you're like, oh, this is just wrong. So we're gonna have fun with this ship. Feel free to throw any insults you want at it, by the way. I'll agree just out of pure anger and spite. But where should we start? The ship's history, its stats. Well, considering that the history is basically non-existent, we can get through it pretty quick. Let's start with that. The Minerva is one of those weapon systems that's both stuck as an in-between of old and developing doctrine, but also was built from the ground up as a fundamentally flawed concept of a weapon system. It's like a horrible cross between something like a battlecruiser and post-World War II heavy tank. To explain a bit, imagine the Minerva suffering all the problems of the Pershing tank and battlecruisers in general, okay? The Pershing was a tank with an identity crisis. It was supposed to be a heavy, but then got downgraded to a medium as they realized that its specs and stuff just really weren't up to the class of a heavy tank at the time. It didn't fit the US doctrine either and suffered constant delays and tomfoolery to slow down its procurement process. And when it eventually did get into service, the war was already over, and in Vietnam it didn't really do much since, well, it was Vietnam. Then, the comparison to battlecruisers. The Minerva was one, and on a fundamental level, like I said, the idea of battlecruisers just doesn't really work. Speed is great and all, but even in World War II, speed wouldn't protect you, and the firepower they had often didn't make up for it since while they could punch, they couldn't take a punch. Queen Mary, Invincible, and Hood greet you with a very warm welcome and a magazine detonation the first time they get hit. In real life, battlecruisers were supposed to be like merchant raiding / harassing forces, kinda like naval cavalry, cleaning up weaker targets, running away from stronger ones, engaging forces that were already kind of dispersed or not in proper formation, and they could really use that speed to hem targets in and their firepower to rip them apart. But in reality, they're ships with huge guns, and when you need firepower, they're pushed into mainline battle where they never were supposed to be, and then they explode. See prior list of British battlecruisers. The Minerva is this. It's an unholy amalgamation of design by doctrine hell and a fundamental fuck-up of what its ship type should be. I had a problem with the Valkyrie being called a Battlestar, like it's so goddamn small and piddly, but at least it had all the aspects, like for its size, it was really durable. For its size, it had a lot of firepower. For its size, it had a lot of support squadrons and stuff, like Vipers and Raptors for it, you know? It had all the elements of a Battlestar, but it was just way too small to be called one. But the Minerva is just as bad because, you know, the Valkyrie was a baby Battlestar. The Minerva is just missing half of what makes one. It just looks similar, so it baits everyone into thinking they're the same. Calming down a little bit before I lose my mind, the Minerva was a super late first Cylon War design. It was designed, presumably, to address several issues that the colonials were facing. Firstly, by this point in the war, their industry was flagging, their war machine was sputtering, and while there was plenty of fight left in them, the Cylons were wearing them down. Second, BattleStars were painfully expensive to produce and had a few weaknesses, like a general lack of speed and dispersed firepower. Essentially, lots of their guns pointed in different directions, so while they could fire all of them off every direction at the same time, like a cowboy firing from the hip, they couldn't use all of them at once effectively. The Minerva was a pretty massive departure from normal designs, since while faster by far than other battleships, it was also exceedingly fragile, having about the protection of a heavy cruiser and focusing most of its main artillery directly forwards in the Alligator Head's gunnery trench. This means that it doesn't have any of those guns on the sides or bottom, so the normally extremely important holy wall of flak that BattleStars rely on for defense just isn't really there. It's this pathetic tiny thing that can barely protect itself. Now, that's fine, you know? Something like the Mercury is in a little bit of a similar position where its flak screen isn't that impressive, but it makes up for it by just having an enormous amount of armor and a fuckload of guns. But the Minerva was designed as a glass cannon, to put as much firepower forward onto a target as possible, and like real-life battlecruisers, it was meant to bully the hell out of smaller ships. The similarities to the Mercury, with that huge, oversized alligator head, were actually an attempt to ameliorate, big words, its survivability issues. Older BattleStars, like the Jupiter, had the head section more flush with the rest of the ship. You know, it didn't really block much, it was just part of that, was, you know, it was supposed to be pointed at the enemy, it was just meant to protect, like, the command and control center and a bunch of the internals and stuff. It wasn't really meant to protect the rest of the ship. The whole thing was armored for protection. But the Minerva has this massive oversized head because from the front arc, it entirely blocks the main core of the ship as well as the engine block. The flight pods are also suspended with far smaller struts than we've seen before, and all of this was probably to shave as much mass as possible from the ship, going for an all-or-nothing protection scheme, while replacing that mass with more firepower. Not necessarily guns, since again, the Jupiter has more by raw number, but while the Jupiter only had 12 missile tubes, the Minerva has double that. And if people are wondering where I got the number, the Jupiter canonically has 12, and in deadlock that accounts for 1 munition slot. The Minerva has 2, so by reason it can fire double the munitions, double the launch tubes. It's not perfect, but again, the canon of Battlestar Galactica is messy, so whatever. I have a license to make things up as I go, and it's my video, so onwards we trek. Now, the Minerva is also roughly between an Artemis and a Jupiter in size, though quite a bit taller than both. Now, the entire idea of this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's got a ton of focus firepower, so it can effectively put more guns straight on target directly forwards, and it has a ton of missiles, so it can vomit out huge amounts of munitions and utility really quickly. But the problem is that we're getting dangerously close to situations like the Hood in real life, where the Minerva is more ammo rack than armor. The ship is incredibly vulnerable and relies on having other vessels take the heat for it, which is mind-numbingly silly to me. The Minerva is still most likely going to be the biggest, scariest ship in the fleet if it's with other support vessels and stuff, yet it's also one of the easiest to destroy. If you're just hammering it with guns and firepower, a Minotaur can survive longer than the Minerva can. A Jupiter will absolutely draw the attention of an entire fleet when it runs into battle, but it can take that punishment and dish out enough firepower to win while the rest of its fleet stays alive and just takes cheap kidney shots on the Cylon fleet. The Minerva, if it tried that, would just explode like the galaxy's biggest pipe bomb when anything looked at it funny. Not to mention that without the full-sized flak screen, those infamously dangerous Cylon missiles have a really easy time slipping in around the edges. And I don't know if it's just me, I don't know if it's just a factor of deadlock, but I swear to God, every single time that the missiles are not coming directly from your flank, they are going to get through the flak screen, at least some of them, and it drives me insane. It feels like some committee somewhere figured that BattleStars were too expensive and wanted to cut cut build costs, but understood nothing about the war they were fighting. The battle bricks require insane firepower and armor. They don't necessarily need to be really fast. That's the point. That's what works. Like, on the surface, it's a cool design, and it makes sense why it would be designed the way it is, but it hurts so bad to see a full-size, properly named BattleStar being so impotent. Like, come on, man. In lore, it's even implied that the Minerva was a failure. Not in like a, oh, it was blown up constantly sort of thing, more like a doctrinal thing. Because on the maiden deployment of the first class of the Minerva itself, it destroyed 3 Cylon ships attacking the fleet yards it was stationed at. They were smaller missile cruisers with pretty weak armor, but the Minerva could absolutely smash fleets of smaller ships. Now, the reason it was a failure is because the Cylons don't tend to use small ships by the mid and late point of the war. As the war went on with the Toasters, they were building bigger and bigger and bigger base ships with more armor and more guns and more fighters that could get past the flak or just dump shitloads of missiles straight into the alligator head. So while the Minerva entered service in the late war period, by that point, most Cylon vessels were not its ideal prey, and saying that it was designed to fight base stars is misleading because it really can't. And we see the development of the Minerva, the Mercury, keep everything that worked but drop everything that didn't. The Mercury is basically a scathing indictment of everything that was done wrong with the Minerva. The Mercury kept the massive alligator head because it provided a lot of forward-facing protection and firepower, kept the really aggressive gun batteries in the trench so that it could bring all of its firepower to bear at the same time if it needed, but it also expanded them dramatically and upgunned the flight pods, the sides, the top, and the bottom for better protection of the ship. The Mercury also vastly increased its armor protection. And while the Minerva was about half as protected as a Jupiter, the Mercury was vastly more solid than even the late war refit that ships like the Galactica went through. The most interesting development that the Minerva had was militarizing the flight pods. Previous BattleStars had never really committed to putting big guns on the hangar bays and stuff. They were mostly just point defense and flat guns. This was both because they took up a lot of space that could be used for more fighters, the guns and the ammo and the, reloading system and stuff, but also the flight pods were semi-sacrificial. Losing them to damage didn't really affect the main fighting power of the ship itself. The Minerva added this tumor-looking brick onto the bottom of the flight pods that housed a number of main battery guns, and the Mercury would not only double the available pod space with 2 more inverted hangars, but place main BattleStar artillery on the tops and bottom, even more broadside and an even thicker flak screen, please. So the legacy of the Minerva, when you look at all the other ships and how it was used and what it did, is essentially being a kind of semi-sorta failure testbed ship due to doctrine, design, and the enemies that it needed to fight just not at all lining up. But while it wasn't very good by itself, a lot of the innovative design elements that were put into it went into arguably the best ship the colonials had ever built. So with its history dealt with, let's talk stats. It's small. I said the Minerva came in between the Artemis and the Jupiter, but specifically it was 1,300 meters long, 560 meters wide, and about 250 meters tall. The size is what makes it really fragile. If it were the size of, like, say, the Valkyrie, it would have really good protection. But being nearly as big as a Jupiter with less than half the protection, yikes. It's about as well protected as a ship a third of its mass. It is, however, extremely fast to make up for it, coming in nearly twice as fast as the next biggest BattleStar, the Jupiter, and being easily able to keep up with smaller light cruisers or frigates/destroyers. This thing can really speed around the battlefield. When it comes to fighters and support craft, the Minerva is also pretty decent, though with an extremely strange asterisk. Matching the Jupiter's capacity, the Minerva can launch about 80 Vipers at a time, with most likely that number again in reserve for combat losses or fast rearm. While it could carry Raptors, and this is that weird asterisk I talked about, the Minerva is explicitly stated to not carry any by default, and instead makes room by decreasing its Viper complement to take a few Raptors along if needed for the mission. Which is really, really funny to me, because why? Like, most of the time, transporting people from one ship to another requires Raptors, and they just don't have any. There's also electronic warfare and some heavy assault and some general utility for other fighters and stuff, and it just doesn't have any. That's so strange, especially because the Mercury, which is essentially the direct successor to the design style, completely removes this. Not only does it have increased fighter bays with more advanced Vipers, but it also has dedicated Raptor launch tubes, which we've never seen on other BattleStars. Which again, kind of seems like the Colonials looked at the Minerva and were like, oh god, this was such a mistake, and then completely went hard 180 the other direction. And when we move on to the guns, there's really no easy way to say this. The Minerva is undergunned. So let's start simple. Missiles, 24 tubes that are nuclear armed. This is excellent. Absolutely fantastic for its size, more than double the Jupiter, great amount of firepower. Main Battlestar artillery, mediocre to bad. It has 10 of the dual battery artillery pieces, so 20 barrels of fuck you. It also has several batteries of heavy cannons on the bottom and sides. Since they have about half the performance as the main artillery in the game, I say we can just comfortably divide by 2 and say 25 barrel equivalent of main Battlestar artillery firepower. Now, the Jupiter, the immediate predecessor in the original Mark I configuration, had 24 main turrets, or 48 barrels of how about die. But that was the early war Jupiter. The late war predominantly had the Jupiter refit, or the Mark II. The Mark II had 40 twin artillery platforms, or 80 barrels of prepare to meet God. And again, like, people don't think about how big they are. We don't have concrete numbers, but we do see very briefly in the remastered series the gun turrets, and we see the targeting and control center where the gunnery crew sits. That's a person in there. And then compare to the guns. Those guns are like 12 feet across. And I'm sorry, Minerva, I really am. But no amount of bullshit in your description about how you're a tool of precision and not brute force is going to help you when brute force himself pile drivers your head into your stomach. You know what? Okay, rant time. This ship even sucks in-game. Like, it has no purpose. You need heavy-hitting firepower. You can bring a bunch of heavy cruisers for the same price, like a Minotaur or something, and they will outperform the Minerva. Or just bring a regular Battlestar to do the job. Bring like one Artemis and then a cruiser or something, it'll be better. But it's like, if you're fighting Cylons, especially in PvP, my god, in PvP or something, every Cylon player that doesn't bring a meme stack of just fighters and missiles kills you deader than dead. It's like, oh, I just camp your flank and you die. And against other Colonial players, it's just, oh, I just send in a Jupiter and you die. Or, I camp on your flank and you die. It's so painful. The extra missile slot does not make up for it. Like, you're a Battlestar, you're supposed to be the center point of a fleet, the anchor to it, yet you're as fragile as a cruiser, so who do you think is going to get focused down first? The fact that the Minerva is so fast also works against it because it'll just run away. It just runs away if you're not paying attention. If you just leave it to go do its thing or you're not really focusing on keeping it with other ships, it'll outrun everything, get isolated, and then die. It's like, what is the point of this thing? Who designed it? Why does it exist in, okay, I'm losing my mind. Ooh, editing Sai here coming in with a little bit of a clarification. So what do I mean by this? Because I realized I didn't explain it very well. To put it quite simply, the Minerva has its guns facing forward, so it wants to be facing forward. And most often that means it's moving towards an enemy fleet. Basically, every other Colonial ship that exists in the game and around this time period that we know about does not want to be doing that. They want to be sort of broadside and underneath their opponent so they can bring most of their broadside firepower to bear. You've got the Jupiter, the Minotaur, you've got stuff like the Ranger, which it just vomits out missiles so it stays with the fleet regardless, and all of that stuff, right? Or you've got the Janus, just big, heavy broadside ships, right? So while all of your fleet is busy sticking together and broadsiding the enemy, the Minerva is off by itself running headfirst into combat, isolating itself, and then it's probably going to get focused and murdered. And if the Minerva is broadside, you're missing like easily half of its firepower, so you gimp the ship dramatically. Suffice to say, the Minerva is really not a very good Battlestar. It's got a frankly pitiful amount of armor compared to even the direct predecessor, while while its speed and focus firepower can be really good, it just doesn't stack up for the flexibility of the Jupiter, which is really funny considering normally mobility gives you more flexibility. It just doesn't have the staying power to actually be useful in multiple situations. And I think the biggest legacy of the Minerva, as far as it was designed by the Deadlock team and how it kind of slots into the timeline and the greater lore, was showing them that the idea of a battlecruiser just doesn't fucking work, and that they should go back to building the biggest, angriest, nuke-to-forehead, face-to-problem pile driver of a battleship they have ever seen, thus producing the Mercury. And by this point, the video's pretty much over. I got nothing else to say. As much as I would love to stretch it out further, I just can't. This is a Deadlock ship. It doesn't really have much lore to it, and a lot of the stuff I did discuss is essentially how it slots in compared to other ships, and comparing it to the lore that surrounds it. So it's not as much knowing what's there, it's more or less like feeling out the shape of its lore by like going around the edges and seeing how it connects to everything else. So if you're wondering where I got all my information from, I pulled a Senator Armstrong, and that's all you really need to know about it. So your interpretation of the ship may be different. This is how I see it, this is how I think it fits into the setting, and that pretty much concludes the video. If you've made it this far, you're clearly the target audience and you clearly enjoyed it, so why not leave a like, subscribe, comment down below, do all of those wonderful things that help the channel out, including ringing the bell button, and maybe go check out some of our other videos. If you found this one interesting, you might find them interesting as well. If you're feeling more generous though, we do have a Patreon where you can throw some money at Science and Sanity for my Staying Alive fund to make sure that I don't go hungry and I've got plenty of coffee to keep me up forever. If, however, you're one of the people already supporting the channel, a huge thanks to the arms dealers who provided all the tools and toys that you saw in this video for hands-on testing and experience. I kinda wish you didn't though, because I have had no fun with the Minerva and have been at constant threat of the thing blowing up by looking at it wrong. To the food merchants making sure that starvation is an ever far away foe, thank you very much. And to the coffee vendors fueling my war on sleep, it goes well, guys. I barely slept at all last night. And with that, I got nothing else to say. Video's pretty much over. Goodbye. See ya on the next one. We're talking about the purple bird.